Hello and welcome to Red Gaming Tech. My name is Amata. Today is the 11th of October, and this time I'm bringing you something a little bit different, as there has been a rather interesting article posted on Gamer Sutra about how the Pokemon iconic designs are actually born, and how each individual Pokemon goes through the design process and the actual process of deciding which ones to pick, which ones to chuck, and so forth. And we have a couple of quotes from Hironobu Yoshida, who did lead the graphic design team for the game's interface, and he also worked on Pokemon designs alongside a team of about 20 designs who came up with ideas for Pokemon. Now, of course, the main star of Pokemon has always been Pikachu, and has pretty much been its mascot for the last bajillion years. But of course, the three starters for each generation of Pokemon is very, very important, and of course, they represent a very important decision for the player, and the game's director Junichi Masuda said, quote, "I do believe they represent a very important position in the Pokemon games. Of course, they're the first Pokemon you pick," and then Yoshida added, "I think they're absolutely necessary to the Pokemon games. Personally, I think they're the ones that should be on the packaging. They're really the face of that generation, and I think even as designers, they feel a bit more special to us than some of the other Pokemon. However, it's not just about the aesthetics of the particular design. The starters are also very, very important in how to basically teach players how to play the game in fundamental ways, and of course, that is rather a challenge to accomplish through visual design, and of course, as well as introducing the player to the basic mechanics and concepts of the new world that they find themselves in, they're also teaching them about basic moves, levels, and just general gameplay in case they are new to it. Of course, for a lot of us, these mechanics are very, very familiar indeed, but if you are new to the franchise or you haven't played it in a while, it just gives you that basic introduction, and also, of course, introduces you to the current region, because apart from Black and White 2, of course, each generation of Pokemon gives you a new generation and a new generation of Pokemon to play with. Now, Matsuda did say, quote, "With the start of Pokemon, they always evolve twice, and a lot of players will use the Pokemon until the end. They teach the players a bit about the basics, so we need to make sure the designs are at the same time easy to understand, the way they evolve, for example, and of course making them appealing is very important to the games." Now, as you might expect, the process of coming up with each Pokemon is rather painstaking, and Yoshida said, quote, "Since there are 20 of us and we're working all on our own ideas, we want to make sure we're not overlapping ideas. At Game Freak, we have an internal server where we can upload our designs and share them with everyone else on the team. This allows us to see what everyone else is working on and get ideas from each other. And getting a Pokemon selected for the final roster, as in it will be officially included in the game, in the Pokedex and all that good stuff, is not what you would call simple." And Yoshida said, quote, "It's very difficult work every time. There are probably 5 to 10 times the number of ideas that are rejected as the ones that make it into the final design. So it's a very difficult process. And as you might expect, they do actually have a committee of about 5 people who will then decide which designs will go into the game and which ones unfortunately would not make the cut." And Yoshida said again, quote, "And they'll also leave feedback on all of the designs, even the ones that are rejected, to say why they got rejected or why they didn't choose a certain one. What that lets us do is improve for the future, so we can use that knowledge for the next series of titles. And it is Yoshida's job to supervise the final look of each individual Pokemon in the form of setup sheets that contain every detail of their appearance." And he said, quote, "I'm in charge of really creating these setup sheets and making the final adjustments to the Pokemon." And he did actually also create the Pokedex for Pokemon X and Y. Now, of course, as you might expect, they also have to take the typing of each individual Pokemon into account, as of course there are 18 individual types, and I needed to fill the roster and provide a balanced experience. Now, of course, for quite a few generations now, we've had dual typing for Pokemon. Of course, you'll have a single type Pokemon like a pure fire or pure water or what have you. It's usually evolutions, or a good chunk of Pokemon will have dual types. Obviously not all, but most. For example, Charizard is fire flying, but at the start of his life he is just pure fire. And of course you have to take that into consideration as well when considering the balance. And Yoshida says, quote, "Of course, we do a lot of free thinking, on our own, but we also get orders from the planners saying we need this type of Pokemon, or even from Mr. Matsuda, the director. He'll say that we need specific Pokemon. Really, one of the good things about the company is that it's really open for discussion. We can talk with each other until both parties come to an agreement, I think." So, as you might expect, designing a rather large batch of Pokemon is a rather painstaking process, to say the least. As, of course, you have to create the design, and then the committee will decide on the design, and then you've got Yoshida looking over everything, adding his touches, making sure that he doesn't want to change anything about the design. Then, of course, you have to think about the typing and the overall balance of the game. You cannot have a distinct advantage to one type of Pokemon, because then, well, in competitive play, you would win with that type of Pokemon if there isn't a good amount of counters to that type of Pokemon. For example, dragons for the longest time have been a bit OP, but now with the inclusion of the fairy type in Pokemon X and Y, we finally have a counter to dragons other than dragons and ice types. Of course, dragons are weak to themselves and of course are weak to ice, but even then, dragons are one of the strongest types in the game, especially if you get a pure dragon Pokemon such as, say, Dragonite, just for example. So we have another counter to that particular typing, which does add a bit more balance, and of course you have to think about that with every single type in the game, and they've added more types as they've gone on. Of course, in the beginning we had a fairly limited selection of types, but then as we went on, we had such as, well, we had dark Pokemon added, and then of course we had the fairy type added, and just so many different Pokemon have been added, and of course the more types you add, the more complicated it is to actually achieve that very delicate balance, and of course the more difficult it is to actually fill the Pokedex with a nice variety of Pokemon, so you're going to have a varied team and have plenty of choices if you wish to have a certain type of Pokemon on your particular six-man team for taking down the Elite Four or what have you. So there you go, a rather interesting insight into the development process of Pokemon, and of course leads rather nicely into the Pokemon X and Y release, which I'm sure many of you are rather excited about. I know I am, to say the least. So yeah, I hope you've enjoyed it. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.